Lady Verity was promised to a powerful duke, a flawless transaction to save her family from absolute ruin. But hiding in the shadows of his coastal estate was a ruthless smuggler who saw the desperate woman trapped beneath the silk. As her wedding day tightened like a diamond collar around her neck, a dangerous rebellion ignited. A story of a caged bride, discovering that true freedom requires risking everything for love. The iron gates of Hawksley Manor loomed against the grey afternoon sky, sealing shut behind the carriage with a heavy clang that sounded terribly like a dropping gavel. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, Lady Verity Linfield kept her hands folded perfectly in her lap, her posture rigid. Beside her, her mother sighed in profound relief, smoothing the skirts of a travelling gown they could no longer afford to replace. "You have saved us, Verity," Lady Linfield whispered, her voice carrying the desperate weight of the past year. "When you walk down the aisle on Saturday, the creditors will finally vanish. The Duke has promised to settle your father's estate in full. You must remember how fortunate you are." Verity looked down at the heavy emerald ring weighing down her left hand. She did not feel fortunate. She felt like a beautiful, expensive object being delivered to a vault. The carriage rolled to a halt before the massive stone facade of the Duke's coastal residence. The ocean roared in the distance, a wild and turbulent sound that contrasted sharply with the stifling perfection of the estate. Desmond Carlyle, the Duke of Hawksley, stood on the grand steps waiting for them. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and impeccable grooming. At 35, he commanded his world with a chilling, quiet authority. He did not step forward to help Verity from the carriage. He merely waited for the footman to present her, his pale eyes inspecting her with the calculating satisfaction of a man admiring a newly purchased thoroughbred. "Lady Verity," Desmond murmured, taking her gloved hand. He did not kiss it. His grip was firm, holding her fingers just a moment too long to ensure she understood who was in control of the interaction. "The sea air brings out your color. It is a relief to see my future Duchess looking so healthy. We have an exhausting schedule of social calls this week to cement the family's standing." "Thank you, Your Grace," Verity replied. Her voice was steady, perfectly modulated, betraying none of the panic fluttering in her chest. "I have had the seamstresses prepare an entirely new wardrobe for you," he continued, turning to lead them inside. "The fabrics you brought from London are quite out of date. As my wife, you will reflect the prestige of the Carlyle name at all times." Verity followed him into the cavernous entrance hall, her stomach twisting. Every marble pillar and gilded mirror seemed to press down on her. Throughout the formal dinner that evening, Desmond dictated her future from the opposite end of a 20-foot mahogany table. The clinking of silver against fine porcelain was the only sound permitted besides his voice. He chose the wine she drank, corrected her opinion on the local landscape, and outlined the rigid, isolated life she would lead once the vows were spoken. He did not ask her a single question about herself. He did not need to. She was not a companion to him. She was a transaction to ensure his lineage. By midnight, the silence of her lavish guest chamber was unbearable. The walls felt like a velvet box slowly closing over her face. She loosened the tight laces of her corset, her breath coming in shallow, anxious gasps. She needed air, not the perfumed, stagnant air of the manor, but the raw, freezing wind of the coast. Throwing a heavy, dark wool cloak over her simple muslin nightgown, Verity slipped out through the terrace doors. She bypassed the manicured gardens, her boots sinking into the damp earth as she hurried toward the sound of the crashing waves. The beach was desolate, illuminated only by the faint silver light of a crescent moon. The wind whipped her hair around her face, cold and biting, and for the first time all day, Verity filled her lungs completely. She walked for what felt like miles, distancing herself from the glowing windows of the estate until the manor was nothing but a distant speck on the cliffs. Ahead of her, the jagged silhouette of an abandoned boathouse rose from the sand. Its roof was half collapsed, the wooden planks rotting from years of salt and neglect. It belonged to the Duke's vast lands, but it stood entirely forgotten at the edge of the property. Verity approached the ruined structure, seeking a moment of shelter from the coastal wind before she turned back to her beautiful prison. But as she stepped into the deep shadow of the doorway, A sharp snap of breaking wood echoed from the darkness inside. She froze, her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. Before she could turn to run, heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside the boathouse. The distinctive rhythmic marching of the coastal patrol grew rapidly closer. Voices carried on the wind, shouting harsh commands to search the shoreline. Verity took a step backward, intending to step into the moonlight and present herself to the guards. But before she could move, a large, rough hand suddenly clamped over her mouth. A powerful arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her entirely off her feet and dragging her backward into the pitch-black depths of the rotting building. Verity thrashed blindly, panic exploding in her veins, but the man holding her was immovable. "Quiet," a voice rasped against her ear, the sound harsh, low, and utterly lethal. "Make a sound, and we both swing from a rope." Verity went entirely still. The man's chest was hard as iron against her back. He smelled of sea salt, damp wool, and an underlying scent of pure, unadulterated danger. This was no gentleman of the ton. Outside, the glow of a lantern swung past the gaps in the wooden walls. The voices of the patrolmen were so close, Verity could hear the heavy jingling of their equipment. "No tracks in the wet sand here," one of the guards called out. "Keep moving toward the cove. Graves couldn't have gotten far." The hand over Verity's mouth remained firm, but the thumb rested surprisingly gently against her cheek, keeping her head tucked beneath the shadow of his broad shoulder. She could feel the steady, calm beating of his heart against her spine. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The heavy footsteps gradually faded down the beach, swallowed by the roar of the freezing ocean. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence in the boathouse was absolute, heavy with an electric, terrifying awareness. Slowly, the man lowered his hand from her face and took a step back, releasing his hold on her waist. Verity spun around, her breath catching in her throat as she backed away. The moonlight, filtering through the broken roof, illuminated him in fractured slices of silver and black. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and entirely rough. Dark, wind-blown hair fell into eyes that studied her with razor-sharp intensity. He wore a heavy mariner's coat, unbuttoned at the collar, and he held a long, curved blade casually at his side. Lachlan Graves. A smuggler, a criminal. A man her fiancé would gladly see hanged in the village square without a second thought. He looked at the fine, expensive lace of her cloak, and then at her pale, terrified face. A cynical, mocking smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "You're a long way from the manor, little bird," Lachlan said, his voice a dark, rough rumble that sent a sudden shiver down her spine. He slowly lowered the blade. "Why didn't you scream?" Verity stared at him, her chest heaving, as she processed the question. She could have alerted the guards. She should have turned him over to the authorities, but as she looked at the dangerous outlaw standing in the shadows of the Duke's forgotten land, a strange, undeniable realization settled over her. She had not screamed, because, for the first time since arriving at Hawksley Manor, she did not feel trapped. The morning sun spilled across the expensive Persian carpets of Hawksley Manor, bright, sterile, and entirely unforgiving. Verity stood perfectly still in the center of her lavish bedchamber as a maid laced her into a pale silk morning gown. Desmond had selected the fabric himself, informing her mother that a future duchess must dress in colors that reflected quiet obedience. The gown was heavy, restrictive, and entirely too elaborate for a simple morning in the country, but the Duke required his future wife to be a flawless display of his wealth. When the maid finally bowed and left the chamber, Verity moved toward the heavy oak wardrobe. Hidden in the darkest corner, crumpled on the floor, was the dark wool cloak she had worn the night before. As she lifted the heavy fabric to fold it away, her breath caught in her throat. Near the shoulder, exactly where the smuggler had pressed his thick forearm against her to drag her into the shadows, was a distinct, rust-colored stain. Blood. He had been bleeding, and yet his grip had been unyielding. He had not made a single sound of pain while the coastal patrol marched past them in the dark. The memory of his hard chest, his rough, demanding voice, and the startling warmth of his hand over her mouth flooded her mind. It was a terrifying memory. She was an aristocrat, and he was a violent criminal. Yet, as she stared at the dried blood on her cloak, she realized it was the only moment since arriving at the estate where her heart had actually beaten with a sense of life. "Verity!" her mother's voice called sharply from the corridor, pulling her from her thoughts. "The Duke is waiting in the breakfast room. You must not keep him." Breakfast was an agonizing ordeal of clinking silver and suffocating expectations. Desmond sat at the head of the long mahogany table, slowly reading his correspondence, while Verity and her mother ate in absolute silence. "I have arranged for a portrait painter to arrive from London tomorrow," Desmond announced, not bothering to look up from his letters. "He will capture you wearing the Hawksley diamonds. Ensure you do not spend too much time walking in the wind today, Verity. Your complexion is already far too flushed, and a duchess must not look like a common village girl." "Of course, Your Grace," she murmured, lowering her gaze to her untouched plate. He did not see her. He only saw the painting she would become, the heir she would eventually provide, and the social status she would secure for his lineage. He reached across the table, taking her hand to inspect her manicured fingers. His touch was dry, cold, and entirely devoid of affection. A shiver of deep, creeping dread settled in her stomach. She was exchanging her youth and her spirit for the survival of her family's ruined estate, and the price was her complete emotional erasure. By early afternoon, Desmond departed for a lengthy meeting with his estate managers, leaving Verity alone with the maddening rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the drawing room. She could not sit there. She could not simply wait for her cage to lock. Moving with quiet, desperate purpose, Verity slipped down the servants' corridor. In the empty pantry, she found a roll of clean linen and a small tin of medicinal salve. She wrapped them carefully in her lace handkerchief and hurried out the side doors into the biting coastal wind, telling the footman she required a brief turn in the garden to cure a headache. She bypassed the manicured hedges entirely. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she made her way toward the jagged cliffs. She told herself it was simple Christian charity. The man was injured, and he had spared her life when he could have easily used her as a hostage. But beneath that polite, acceptable lie was a desperate, undeniable pull. She was walking back into danger because the shadows of the rotting boathouse felt infinitely safer than the gilded halls of Hawksley Manor. The ruined structure looked even more desolate in the grey, flat light of the afternoon. Verity hesitated at the broken doorway, her fingers gripping the linen in her pocket. The air inside was thick with the smell of brine and old timber. "You have a terrible habit of walking into places you don't belong, little bird," she gasped, spinning around. Lachlan Graves emerged from the deeper shadows near the hull of a rotting skiff. In the daylight, he was even more imposing. His jaw was lined with dark stubble, and his eyes, a piercing, stormy grey, watched her with intense suspicion. He was not wearing his heavy mariner's coat, and his left shirt sleeve was soaked with dark, dried blood. "I brought you this," Verity said, her voice trembling slightly as she pulled the linen and salve from her pocket. Lachlan stared at the pristine white cloth in her gloved hands, then slowly raised his gaze to her face. He laughed, a short, humorless sound that echoed in the empty room. "A duke's bride, running errands for a wanted man. If you are trying to trap me, your fiancé's guards are remarkably quiet." "No one knows I am here," she replied, stepping cautiously closer, ignoring the warning bells ringing in her mind. "You were bleeding last night. You did not harm me when you easily could have. I am repaying the debt." He watched her for a long, silent moment, searching her eyes for deception. Finding none, he moved to a wooden crate and sat heavily, rolling up his stiff, blood-stained sleeve. A deep, jagged cut ran along his muscled forearm. Verity removed her silk gloves, laying them delicately on a broken barrel. Her hands shook as she approached him, but she forced herself to remain steady. She knelt beside him, the rough wood of the floor biting into the silk of her dress, and uncapped the salve. As her soft, pale fingers touched his scarred, sun-browned skin, a sharp jolt of awareness passed between them. Lachlan tensed, not from the sting of the medicine, but from the incredible contrast of her delicate touch against his violent life. He looked down at her bowed head, watching the careful, gentle way she worked. "You should not be here," he said softly, his voice losing its mocking edge. "Men have hanged for less than speaking to a woman in a dress like that." "Then it is fortunate no one is looking," she murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on her task as she wrapped the linen carefully around his arm. His skin was warm, solid, and completely alive. It was nothing like the cold, calculating grasp of the Duke. "Why are you marrying him?" Lachlan asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence of the boathouse. Verity stiffened, pulling the knot of the bandage tight. "He is a duke. It is a brilliant match. Any woman would be fortunate to—" "Stop lying," Lachlan interrupted, his tone quiet but absolute. She looked up, startled. He was leaning forward, his stormy eyes locking onto hers with a piercing perception that stripped away every polite defense she possessed. "I know how your kind works," Lachlan continued, his gaze drifting to the heavy emerald ring on her trembling finger. "You buy horses, you buy land, and you buy wives. I have seen women look at the men they love, and I have seen men walk up the steps to the gallows. You, little bird, have the exact look of the condemned." The breath vanished completely from Verity's lungs. He had done in 10 minutes what her own mother and society had failed to do for a year. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen the absolute terror she was hiding behind her flawless aristocratic mask. She could not find a single word to defend herself. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy with dangerous truths, changing the space between them forever. The formal dining room of Hawksley Manor felt less like a place of celebration and more like a polished, candle-lit tribunal. 3 days had passed since Verity had bandaged the smuggler's arm, and with every passing hour, the walls of the estate seemed to press closer together. Desmond sat at the head of the table, entertaining a magistrate from the neighboring county. Verity sat perfectly still, a heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone like an icy weight. "Lady Verity will bring a certain traditional grace to the London season," Desmond remarked, swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. He did not look at her as he spoke. "Her family possesses an older, quieter lineage. It requires a firm hand to properly guide her into the responsibilities of the Carlisle name, but she is highly adaptable. Like a young mare of good breeding, she simply requires the correct instruction." The magistrate chuckled, offering a polite toast to the Duke's impeccable judgment. Verity stared at the flickering candle flames, her chest tightening until she could barely draw a breath. She was not a person at this table. She was an acquisition, a beautiful, silent asset purchased to decorate his arm and warm his bed, entirely devoid of her own voice. By the time the agonizing dinner concluded and the great house finally fell silent, Verity was shaking. The despair was no longer a quiet shadow. It was a physical weight crushing her lungs. She did not bother to change out of her heavy silk evening gown. She merely threw the dark wool cloak over her shoulders and fled the manor, practically running blindly toward the violent sound of the ocean. She did not care about the coastal patrols. She did not care about the freezing wind whipping her hair into a tangled mess. She only knew she needed to reach the one place in the entire county where she was allowed to be real. When she practically collapsed through the broken doorway of the boathouse, the interior was dimly lit by a single, shielded lantern. Lachlan was sitting on an overturned crate, repairing a torn canvas sack with a heavy needle and twine. He looked up, the sharp warning on his face melting instantly into fierce concern when he saw her. Verity leaned against the rotting doorframe, fighting a losing battle against the tears that spilled over her pale cheeks. The perfect, flawless debutante was completely shattered. She covered her face with her trembling hands, a raw, broken sob escaping her throat. Lachlan dropped the canvas. In 2 long strides, he crossed the room, his large hands gripping her shoulders to steady her. He did not ask if she was injured. He did not offer empty, polite comforts. "What did he do to you?" Lachlan demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating pitch. His thumbs pressed into the heavy silk of her cloak, anchoring her to the earth. "He did nothing!" Verity gasped, the words tearing out of her before she could stop them. "He does nothing. He just looks at me, and I disappear. I am disappearing, Lachlan. Soon there will be nothing left of me but the title." She pulled away slightly, pacing the small, damp space of the boathouse like a trapped animal, her composure entirely ruined. "You asked why I am marrying him," she continued, her voice trembling with the crushing guilt she had carried in secret for over a year. "My father died leaving debts that would shame a gambler. We have nothing. My mother has been selling the silver piece by piece just to pay the servants. If I do not marry the Duke, my family will be thrown into the streets. He is not marrying me out of affection. He is buying my lineage to settle the ledgers. I am a transaction." She stopped, leaning heavily against a wooden support beam, waiting for the smuggler to laugh. She waited for him to mock her aristocratic tragedy, to tell her that a life in a mansion, even a loveless one, was a privilege she should silently endure. But Lachlan did not mock her. The hard, cynical edge of his jaw softened. He looked at the heavy diamond pendant resting against her chest, and then at the absolute devastation in her eyes. He stepped closer, moving into her space with a quiet, undeniable presence that immediately grounded her frantic pulse. "They trade flesh for gold and call it honor," Lachlan said, his voice a low, bitter rumble that filled the empty room. "And they dare to call men like me criminals." He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. The touch was startlingly tender, a massive contrast to the violence of his reputation. "When I was 15, Lachlan murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, holding her gaze with absolute honesty, "my sister was starving. I was caught poaching a single rabbit on the estate of a wealthy lord. By law, I should have been hanged, but the lord saw a desperate boy who could run fast and keep quiet. He made me his runner. He forced me to move stolen cargo along the coast to line his own pockets." Verity stopped crying, her breath catching as she listened to the raw pain in his voice. "When the local magistrate finally closed in," Lachlan continued, the muscle in his jaw ticking, "that honorable lord handed me over to the authorities without a second thought to save his own neck. I escaped the transport ship, but my sister died of winter fever while I was rotting in a cell." He stepped even closer, the heat of his large body radiating against the freezing coastal wind cutting through the wooden planks. "I learnt exactly what a title is worth, Verity. It is a shield for cowards, and the man sitting in that manor up the hill is the worst kind of coward. He is buying your life because he is too hollow to earn it." Verity looked up at him, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Society told her Lachlan Graves was a monster. But standing in the dim light of the lantern, she saw a man with more integrity, more protective honor than any gentleman she had ever met in a London ballroom. Lachlan lifted his hand again. This time, he did not just brush away a tear. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not cold or calculating. It was reverent. It was the touch of a man holding something infinitely precious. "You are selling your soul for ghosts, little bird," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air in the boathouse grew impossibly thick. The roar of the ocean outside faded into nothing. Verity could feel the heat of his breath against her skin. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his palm, a desperate, aching need blooming in her chest. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to feel, just for a moment, what it was like to be chosen by a man who truly saw her. Lachlan's head dipped, the distance between them vanishing, until their lips were a mere breath apart. The electric, overwhelming tension paralyzed them both. But then, with a heavy, ragged exhale, Lachlan stopped, his eyes squeezed shut, and he slowly, agonizingly, pulled his hand away, taking a deliberate step back into the shadows. He could not ruin her, and she could not abandon her family. The truth hung between them, heavy and devastating. The line had been crossed in their hearts, but the world outside the boathouse was waiting to destroy them both. The days that followed blurred into a torturous division of two entirely separate lives. By sunlight, Verity was a ghost haunting the opulent halls of Hawksley Manor. She allowed herself to be positioned, measured, and discussed by dressmakers and the Duke's associates as if she were a valuable piece of antique furniture. She smiled blankly, spoke softly, and did exactly as she was commanded. But by moonlight, She was alive. Every night, when the grand house finally fell asleep, she slipped away to the ruined boathouse. It became a silent, sacred ritual. They did not speak of the near kiss, but the memory of it hummed in the damp air between them. An invisible wire pulled terrifyingly taut. Lachlan did not attempt to touch her again, and she did not ask him to, because the fragile boundary between them was the only thing keeping them sane. He was protecting her, even in secret, refusing to cross a line that would ruin her conscience. Instead, they shared the absolute truth of who they were. Lachlan shared pieces of his world, the violent beauty of the open ocean, the fierce loyalty of his crew, and the quiet, impossible dream of a small, honest farm in America. In return, Verity stripped away the aristocratic title to reveal the quiet, observant girl who had always loved the smell of old books and the sound of the rain. They were building a world in the shadows, acutely aware that it could never survive the dawn. On the fifth night, the sanctuary shattered. Verity was sitting on a wooden crate, laughing softly at a cynical joke Lachlan had made about the House of Lords, when the heavy crunch of boots sounded on the gravel outside. Lachlan moved with terrifying speed, extinguishing the lantern and drawing his blade in a single, fluid motion. He pushed Verity behind him, shielding her completely with his broad shoulders. A low, sharp whistle cut through the wind, 2 short notes, followed by a long trill. Lachlan lowered the blade, though the tension in his muscles remained tightly coiled. He unlatched the heavy wooden door, allowing a shorter, broad-shouldered man to slip inside. The newcomer stopped, his sharp eyes catching the silhouette of Verity standing in the shadows. He looked at Lachlan in absolute disbelief. "Have you lost your mind, Captain?" the man hissed, his thick Irish accent cutting through the dark. "A duke's woman. If they catch you with her, they won't just hang you. They'll draw and quarter you in the public square." "Mind your tone, Finn," Lachlan warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He did not step away from Verity. "What is the news?" Finn shook his head, pulling off a soaked woolen cap. "The net is closing. The magistrate brought in 2 more revenue cutters from the south. They are sweeping the coves tonight. The ship is safely hidden, but the tide turns in 2 days. If we do not sail by Friday night, we don't sail at all. We will be trapped in the bay." The words fell like heavy stones on the wooden floor. Friday night, the eve of her wedding. "Tell the men to prepare the rigging," Lachlan ordered, his gaze fixed intensely on the rotting floorboards. "We leave on the Friday tide." Finn nodded grimly, casting one last pitying look at Verity, before slipping back out into the freezing wind. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lachlan slowly turned to face her in the gloom. The unspoken truth hung between them, heavy and final. He was leaving. The stolen moments in the dark were over. He looked at her with a quiet, devastating grief, recognizing that he had nothing to offer her but a life of poverty and running, and she had a ruined family she could not abandon. The following afternoon, Hawksley Manor hummed with a manic, organized energy. Servants carried heavy crates of imported wine into the cellars, and the scent of expensive hothouse flowers filled the main hall. Verity stood numbly in the center of the drawing room, feeling entirely detached from the preparations for her own life. Desmond entered the room, moving with his usual precise, predatory elegance. He carried a long, flat, velvet box. "The seamstresses have completed the final alterations on the gown," Desmond announced, signaling for Verity's mother to step back. He approached Verity, stopping just inches away. "It is time you wore the symbol of your new station." He opened the box. Resting on the dark velvet was a necklace of massive, glittering diamonds, intricate and impossibly heavy. It was a masterpiece of immense wealth, and to Verity, it looked exactly like a chain. "Turn around," he instructed. Verity obeyed automatically, her limbs feeling like lead. Desmond lifted the heavy stones from the velvet. The metal was shockingly cold as it settled against her bare collarbone. He fastened the complicated clasp at the nape of her neck, his fingers brushing her skin with a possessive chill that made her stomach violently churn. "Beautiful," her mother breathed from the corner of the room, her voice thick with absolute relief. "She looks like a true Carlyle." Desmond stepped around to face Verity, inspecting his property with cold satisfaction. "I received word from the bishop this morning," he said smoothly, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "He is required in London earlier than expected. We will not wait for the weekend. The wedding ceremony will take place tomorrow morning." The floor seemed to drop entirely away from beneath Verity's feet. Tomorrow? It was impossible. She needed more time. "Tomorrow?" her mother gasped, quickly masking her surprise with a delighted smile. "Your Grace, that is wonderful news. We shall have everything ready." Verity could not speak. The heavy diamonds pressed into her chest, restricting her breath. Tomorrow morning. Lachlan was leaving on the Friday tide, but by then she would already belong to the Duke. The remaining hours of her freedom had just been violently stolen away. "See that you rest tonight, Verity," Desmond commanded, completely misreading her frozen shock as maidenly nerves. "Tomorrow, you belong to Hawksley." When the midnight clock finally chimed through the silent estate, Verity was alone in her chamber. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. She had not removed the diamond necklace. She stared at herself in the gilded mirror, seeing a pale, beautifully decorated corpse. The diamonds sparkled cruelly in the dim light. They were the price of her father's debts, the physical manifestation of her duty. If she stayed, her spirit would quietly starve to death behind marble walls, locked away by a man who did not know her soul and did not care to learn. A sudden, frantic desperation seized her. She could not breathe. The diamonds felt like they were slicing into her throat. She needed Lachlan. She needed his rough honesty, his protective warmth, and the absolute certainty in his eyes. Without changing out of her evening gown, Verity threw the heavy dark cloak over her shoulders. She did not bother to hide her footsteps as she ran down the servants' stairs. She tore across the manicured lawns, running blindly into the freezing, violent coastal wind, terrified that if she did not reach the boathouse in time, she would lose the only piece of her heart that had ever truly mattered. The violent coastal wind tore at Verity's dark cloak as she stumbled down the jagged path toward the beach. Her breath burned in her throat, her lungs aching with the icy air, but she did not slow her frantic pace. The ocean roared to her right, a chaotic, massive sound that matched the absolute panic thrashing in her own chest. When she burst through the broken doorway of the boathouse, the heavy silence inside felt like a physical blow. The lantern was lit, casting long, wavering shadows across the rotting timber. Lachlan stood in the center of the room. He was wearing his heavy mariner's coat, and at his feet sat a single, tightly bound canvas sea bag. He was tying the final knot, his broad shoulders tense, his movements sharp and final. Verity froze in the doorway, the freezing wind whipping her tangled hair around her face. Lachlan looked up. The moment he saw her, the stoic, hardened mask of the smuggler fractured, revealing a raw, devastating agony beneath. He dropped the rough rope, taking a half step toward her, before forcing himself to stop. "What are you doing here, Verity?" he asked, his voice entirely hollow. "You should be asleep. You should be safe in the manor." "You are leaving," she breathed, the words barely a whisper, yet they echoed loudly in the damp room. He could not hold her gaze. He looked away, staring at the dark, crashing waves visible through the broken wall. The revenue cutters moved up the coast. Finn brought the skiff to the cove. "If we do not sail on the midnight tide, we will hang by morning. I was going to leave before the dawn to spare you the goodbye." "The Duke moved the wedding," Verity choked out, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edges of her cloak. "It is tomorrow morning, Lachlan. Not the weekend, tomorrow." Lachlan's head snapped back to her. His stormy grey eyes widened, registering the absolute terror in her voice. He saw the heavy silk of her evening gown beneath the open cloak, and then his gaze locked onto the massive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The stones glittered cruelly in the lantern light, an unmistakable, heavy chain of ownership, a muscle feathered in his jaw. The sight of the Duke's wealth strapped to her throat tore through the last of his iron restraint. In 2 massive strides, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Verity collapsed against his solid chest, a ragged, broken sob tearing from her lips. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat, her hands gripping his lapels as if he were the only stable thing left in the entire world. Lachlan wrapped his arms around her, holding her so fiercely it stole her breath. He buried his face in her wind-blown hair, inhaling the scent of her, shaking with the impossible weight of what he was about to lose. "Verity," he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, overwhelming need. She looked up at him, her tear-stained face pale in the dim light. She did not want his comfort. She did not want his apologies. She only wanted him. When his mouth crashed down on hers, the world outside the boathouse ceased to exist. The kiss was not polite, and it was not gentle. It was a desperate, starving collision of two people who had spent their entire lives chained to the expectations of others, finally claiming something for themselves. Verity opened to him completely, threading her fingers into his dark hair, pulling him closer until the cold edge of the diamonds pressed painfully into his chest. Lachlan groaned, a deep, rough sound of surrender. He backed her against the solid timber of the wall, his large hands sweeping down to grip her waist. He kissed her with a consuming, fiery passion that chased away the freezing dampness of the room. He tasted like sea salt, whiskey, and absolute honesty. For the first time in her life, Verity was not a transaction, a title, or a duty. She was a woman, fiercely and entirely desired by the man she loved. They sank into the shadows of the boathouse, the heavy darkness hiding them from the cruel reality of the world. In the quiet, desperate intimacy of the rotting structure, they belonged only to each other. He touched her with a reverence that made her weep, worshipping the quiet strength he had seen in her from the very first night. She held him with a fierce protectiveness, offering him the emotional sanctuary he had been denied his entire life. But time, relentless and cruel, refused to stop. When the heat of their desperate connection finally faded into a heavy, aching quiet, they sat together on his heavy coat, spread across the floorboards. Verity rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. She closed her eyes, wishing she could stop the rotation of the earth, wishing the dawn would never come. "Take me with you," Verity whispered into the dark. Lachlan's heart stuttered against her cheek. His large hand, which had been gently stroking her hair, froze. "I will leave the diamonds," she continued, sitting up and looking into his eyes with absolute, desperate conviction. "I will leave the title. I do not care about the cold or the danger. I only care about you. Take me to the ship, Lachlan. Let me run with you." Lachlan looked at her, his expression shattering. It was the only thing he had ever truly wanted. To take her away, to keep her safe, to build a life where no one could ever look at her as a piece of property again. But as he looked at her pale, delicate skin, her shivering frame, and the absolute destruction that would rain down on her family, the memory of a cold, damp cell and his sister's lifeless body hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was a wanted criminal. His ship was a target. If they were caught, he would hang, and she would be cast into a freezing, filthy prison for treason, entirely disgraced. He could not let his selfish love destroy her. "No," Lachlan said, the word costing him every ounce of strength he possessed. Verity reeled back as if he had struck her. "Lachlan, please." "No, Verity," he repeated, his voice hardening into a mask of brutal, necessary coldness. He stood up, pulling her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders firmly. "Look at me. I have nothing to offer you but a wanted poster and a life looking over your shoulder. You would freeze on that ship. You would starve in the ports, and your mother would be thrown into the streets by a furious duke. I would rather starve with you than die slowly in that house," she cried, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I will not let you die in either place," he said fiercely, his thumbs brushing the tears away. He looked at the diamond necklace, his jaw tight. "You have a duty to your blood, and I have a duty to my men. We are from different worlds, little bird, and mine is too dark for you." He picked up her heavy wool cloak from the floor and wrapped it around her shivering shoulders. He pulled the hood up, shielding her face. "You will go back to the manor," Lachlan commanded gently, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You will marry the Duke. You will save your family. And you will forget the smuggler who had the arrogance to touch you." Verity shook her head, unable to speak through the crushing, agonizing weight in her chest. She reached for him, but he stepped back, putting a deliberate, final distance between them. He hoisted the heavy canvas bag onto his shoulder. He did not look back as he walked out of the broken doorway, stepping into the violent coastal wind and disappearing completely into the impenetrable darkness of the beach. Verity collapsed onto her knees, alone in the rotting boathouse, the silence of his absence screaming in her ears. She stayed there until her tears ran entirely dry, until the freezing dampness seeped into her bones. Slowly, mechanically, she pulled herself up from the floorboards. The fire that had ignited inside her was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow expanse of ice. She walked back to Hawksley Manor like a ghost. The massive stone estate loomed against the night sky, a beautiful, gilded tomb waiting to swallow her whole. She slipped through the terrace doors and moved silently up the grand staircase. When she finally reached her chamber, she sat on the edge of the large, cold bed. She did not take off the heavy diamond necklace. It felt like an anchor, dragging her down to the bottom of the ocean. Hours passed in suffocating silence. Finally, the first pale grey light of dawn crept over the horizon, bleeding through the heavy velvet curtains. The estate began to wake. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her door. A sharp knock broke the silence. "My lady," the head maid called out softly. "It is time to prepare. It is your wedding day." The village church of Hawksley was a towering masterpiece of ancient stone and stained glass, designed to make every occupant feel incredibly small beneath the weight of the Carlisle legacy. By 10 o'clock, the pews were packed with the highest echelons of society. Silk rustled, pocket watches clicked, and the scent of heavy perfume fought against the cold, damp stone of the sanctuary. Verity stood in the vestibule, completely numb. Her gown was a fortress of heavy white silk and Belgian lace, suffocating in its perfection. Around her neck, the Hawksley diamonds felt like a band of pure ice, radiating a cold that had long since settled deep into her bones. Her mother fussed with her veil, weeping tears of absolute relief, completely blind to the fact that she was preparing her daughter for a burial. The heavy organ music began to play, a grand, oppressive march that signaled the end of her life. The massive oak doors opened. Verity stepped forward into the cavernous nave. Every head turned, hundreds of eyes locked onto her, admiring the flawless execution of a perfect aristocratic transaction. At the end of the long crimson carpet stood Desmond Carlyle. He wore immaculate mourning dress, his posture rigid, his pale eyes watching her approach with the smug, calculating satisfaction of a man closing a highly profitable ledger. He did not smile. He merely waited to collect his property. Verity moved mechanically. One step, then another. The air in the church was too thin. Her vision tunneled, the vibrant colors of the stained glass bleeding into a monotonous, suffocating gray. She was walking into a tomb, and she was doing it willingly. She thought of the rotting boathouse, of the smell of salt and damp wool, of rough hands that held her like she was sacred. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, mourning the smuggler who was currently sailing away on the morning tide, taking her soul with him to America. She reached the altar. Desmond extended his hand. She placed her trembling, gloved fingers into his cold grip. The bishop stepped forward, opening his gilded prayer book. He began to speak of duty, of holy union, and of the sacred responsibilities of the nobility. His voice droned on, a monotonous hum that faded entirely beneath the roaring in Verity's ears. Then, a sudden, sharp draught of freezing air swept through the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church had opened. A low murmur rippled through the back pews, spreading forward like a wave crashing against the shore. Aristocrats shifted, indignant whispers breaking the solemn silence. The bishop frowned, pausing his sermon, deeply offended by the interruption. Desmond's grip tightened painfully on Verity's fingers as he turned his head with a look of absolute, icy fury. Verity turned around. Standing in the center aisle, framed by the bright morning light pouring through the open doors, was Lachlan Graves. He was not wearing the polite attire of a gentleman. He wore his heavy, salt-stained mariner's coat, his dark hair wind-blown and wild. He stood amidst the silk and wealth of London's elite like a dangerous wolf that had wandered into a cage of peacocks. 4 armed estate guards were already moving cautiously toward him from the side aisles, but Lachlan did not even look at them. His stormy grey eyes were locked entirely on Verity. He had risked the gallows. He had sacrificed his tide, his escape, and his safety, simply because his freedom meant absolutely nothing in a world where she did not exist. The absolute devotion radiating from him crossed the massive distance of the church, hitting Verity with the force of a tidal wave. The ice in her veins shattered. The suffocating grey of the sanctuary vanished, replaced by the brilliant, violent, terrifying colour of real life. He had not abandoned her to the dark. He had come back to the light to claim her. "Guards," Desmond barked, his voice echoing sharply off the stone walls, stripping away his polished veneer to reveal the cruel tyrant beneath. "Seize that criminal immediately! Drag him outside and lock him in the estate cells until the magistrate arrives." The guards drew their batons, moving in on the smuggler. Lachlan did not draw his blade. He did not fight them. He simply stood his ground, his eyes silently begging Verity to understand that he would gladly hang if his last sight was her beautiful face. Verity looked at Lachlan. Then she looked at the Duke, whose face was twisted into an ugly, possessive snarl. In that single, crystalline moment, the heavy chains of duty, guilt, and society fell away. She realized that saving her family's wealth by marrying a monster was not an act of noble sacrifice. It was an act of cowardice. She was choosing a slow, sterile death over the terrifying, glorious risk of a real life. "No," Verity whispered. Desmond snapped his attention back to her, his pale eyes narrowing in shock. "What did you say?" "I said no," Verity repeated, her voice steadying, growing louder, echoing into the silent, horrified church. She pulled her hand violently out of Desmond's grip. With a sudden, fierce motion, she reached behind her neck. Her fingers found the complicated gold clasp of the Hawksley diamonds. She pulled, the metal biting into her skin, until the heavy chain snapped. A collective gasp echoed through the pews as the massive, priceless diamond necklace clattered harshly against the cold stone floor, discarded like a piece of worthless glass. "You are insane," Desmond hissed, with face flushing with absolute rage. He stepped forward, reaching for her arm to force her back into position. "You will not ruin this family. Pick that up and turn around." "I am not your property," Verity said, her voice ringing with a newfound, unbreakable authority. "And I would rather be ruined with him than be perfectly preserved with you." She threw her heavy silk bridal bouquet squarely at the Duke's chest, taking immense satisfaction as he stumbled backward in shock. Lifting the heavy layers of her white gown, Verity turned her back on the altar, the bishop, and the entire aristocracy. She ran down the long crimson aisle, her silk slippers flying over the stones, pushing past the shocked faces of her mother and the silent, staring lords. "Verity!" her mother screamed, a sound of absolute despair. But Verity did not stop. The guards at the back of the church hesitated, bewildered by the sight of a duke's bride sprinting wildly toward a wanted criminal. Their hesitation was all Lachlan needed. A fierce, triumphant smile broke across his rugged face. He stepped past the nearest guard, opening his arms wide, just as Verity launched herself into them. Lachlan caught her securely, lifting her off the ground. The force of their collision sent them stumbling back a step, but his embrace was like iron, wrapping her in the familiar, intoxicating scent of salt and wool. He buried his face in her neck, holding her as if he would never let her go, ignoring the chaos exploding in the sanctuary around them. "You came back," she sobbed into his shoulder, laughing wildly through her tears. "I couldn't leave my heart behind," he breathed, kissing the side of her head fiercely. "Stop them!" Desmond roared from the altar, practically vibrating with fury. Lachlan set her down, firmly gripping her hand. "Can you run in that dress, little bird?" "Watch me," she answered, her eyes blazing with absolute defiance. They bolted through the heavy oak doors, bursting out into the freezing, bright morning sunlight. The coastal wind caught Verity's veil, tearing it from her hair, carrying the expensive lace away into the sky. They sprinted across the church courtyard, dodging a bewildered carriage driver, and plunged into the thick woods that led down to the hidden cove. They ran until their lungs burned, guided by the sound of the crashing waves. When they broke through the tree line, the hidden bay opened before them. Anchored in the deep water was Lachlan's ship, its sails already unfurled and snapping loudly in the wind. Finn was standing at the helm of a small skiff, waiting on the sand, his eyes wide with utter disbelief as he saw his captain emerge from the trees, pulling a woman in a massive wedding gown. "You actually did it!" Finn yelled over the wind, shaking his head in absolute shock as they splashed into the freezing water to climb aboard. "You stole the Duke's bride." "I didn't steal her, Finn," Lachlan corrected, pulling Verity securely into the small boat as the men began to row fiercely toward the ship. He looked down at her, his stormy eyes filled with a profound, quiet reverence. She saved herself. By the time they reached the deck of the larger ship, Hawksley Manor was nothing but a distant grey shadow on the cliffs, shrinking rapidly as the vessel caught the strong ocean breeze. Verity stood at the stern, leaning against the wooden railing. The heavy silk of her dress was soaked with seawater and stained with sand, the perfect image of high society entirely ruined. She had never felt so beautifully alive. Lachlan moved up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest to shield her from the freezing wind. He rested his chin on the top of her head, watching the English coast disappear into the horizon. There would be hardships ahead. They would have to build a new life from nothing in a strange country. But as Verity turned in his arms, looking up into the face of the man who truly saw her, she knew she had finally found the only home she would ever need. He lowered his head, capturing her lips in a deep, slow kiss that promised a lifetime of freedom, truth, and an entirely unconventional love. Thank you for joining us for this romantic journey on our channel. If Lady Verity and Lachlan's daring escape touched your heart, please take a moment to gently tap the like button to help this story find other listeners who enjoy deep, emotional Victorian romances. We would love to hear your thoughts on Verity's courageous choice in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next heartfelt adventure. Until we meet again, may you always find the courage to follow where true love leads.